So most people would consider themselves a critical thinker. If you ask them, they said, oh, of course, I think critically. But I've met most people, and I can assure you that is not the case. So what does it actually look like to be a critical thinker?
Yeah, I get that a lot. Like people, hey, do you think critically about this? And they're like, yeah. But honestly, most people just shoot from the hip. And so when they think about something for 30 seconds, they feel like, man, I feel like I really critically explored that topic. But what I've realized is that when it comes to critical thinking, it's not hey, I need to go lock myself in a room for hours and hours and hours to really think about this. There's two key things that I've realized when it comes to critical thinking. It's knowing the right questions to ask and then having the right frameworks to use that information in. Because questions and frameworks help you get out of your own head and help you think about things more objectively.
So it's not just going with your gut and thinking about that for a second and then spewing out the answer. We've got to ask some really good questions.
Exactly.
Not surface level. We got to go deeper than that. So I know you, in your leadership role here at Ramsey, you've been challenged in a lot of ways to think more critically. Can you give us like a recent example of where you had to do this in practice?
Yeah, so I had a leader here at Ramsey talk to me about a thought exercise. So typically a thought exercise, again, is just a way to sit down and think about a project objectively. And so what he did is he said, hey, sit down for 30 minutes. I was about to take over this project. We already knew that I was going to lead it. And it was a big project. It was migrating 23 domains into one domain. So that's a lot. And I had never led something at that scale. And so the project, as I sat down and thought about it, he said, okay, sit down and say, if that project is successful, what is true of the person leading it? So what are the skills and attributes that person had? Now, the key is I took myself out of it. You don't think, what do I have to bring to this? You say, what needs to be true of that person? So you write down all the different attributes. So there were things like needs to understand our marketing technology stack, so very specific skills. But there were also things like needs to be their A1 priority. Once I had that list, I then said, okay, what's true of me relative to this role? So I went through each of the things. Is this a strength of mine? Yeah, great. Okay, I have that. Is this a weakness of mine? And then once you realize these are the things that I have a deficit in, you can say, okay, I'm either going to fill that where I'm going to level up, or I'm going to bring somebody into the team to help me out with this.
To fill in those gaps.
Exactly.
But that took a level of deep thinking instead of just going, all right, I'll figure it out. And then you realize, I don't have it figured out, and you haven't got the right team in place. So this is really important to ask these questions right up front.
Exactly, because it didn't solve all my problems, right? But it set me up to make decisions that made the project better. I realized the key things that I was deficient in. I brought key people and added them to a core team. I knew that communication was going to be important. So I spent time on figuring out how do we communicate this across the organization.
So you mentioned frameworks up front, and there's a relationship between asking good questions and having the right frameworks. Which ones have you found to be the most helpful when you're trying to get your team to think critically?
Yeah, one of the best frameworks you could use is called the 5 whys. So when your child asks you for something, typically if you say no, what do they respond with?
Why?
Yes, and then you answer that, and then what do they respond with?
Why?
And then what do they respond with after you give the next answer? Yes, to the point where finally you go, because I'm your parent and I said so. Right? But there's something in that of continuing to ask why that will help you understand what you need to do. So a lot of times we start solving a problem. We have a problem that comes up and we start solving it. But when you ask why is this a problem? Then once you get that answer, you say, well, why is that true? And then why is that true? And what happens is you ask that enough times and you get to the root problem, and that's what you actually need to solve, not the thing that you thought was the problem.
Interesting. So you're kind of getting way below the surface. And most leaders, they're probably looking at it and going, why? Okay, let's move forward. Let's just go do the thing, Casey. We don't have time to sit here all day and ponder. What do you say to that person?
Well, a lot of times when people say, no, I want action, I need to do this now, what you're saying is, I just want to do this action multiple times, right? So if you go and don't do that 5 whys and you solve that symptom, you're going to have to solve a different symptom later because you never addressed the root problem. So there may be more time at the beginning, but it's going to save you more time in the long term.
Yeah. That's good. 5 whys. Any other frameworks that you found helpful?
Yeah, there's a thing called a pre-mortem. So you may
I've
have
heard
heard
of
of
postmortem.
Yes, you've heard of postmortem.
This is the prequel.
Yes, a postmortem, for people that don't know, is after a project is over, you look back and say, hey, what worked, what didn't. A pre-mortem is where you sit down and say, it's another thought exercise. If this project or this thing I'm trying to do is successful, right? You don't want to look at that. That's what everybody thinks. No, you switch it and you say, if this thing is a failure, what are the potential things that caused it to be that way? And then you sit down and go, okay, well, now keep that in the realm of possibility, right? Because you want to say things like, a shipment didn't arrive on time, or we didn't calculate the estimates or something like that. So you want to keep it in reality. You don't want to say, a plane fell out of the sky and smashed my van. You can't deal with all of those sort of things, but you find a set of things that are possible things that could derail, and then you put things in place to make sure that those don't happen.
Yeah, that's smart. I mean, it feels like premarital counseling. It's important, right? You want to put yourself in a good spot and have the team prepared so that when something does go wrong, it doesn't throw the whole thing off and it becomes a failure.
Exactly.
So we're just thinking through it ahead of time.
Yeah,
That's great.
Because when it comes to the way we approach things with our gut, one thing we don't realize that we always bring to the table is bias. So a lot of times we have hindsight bias. So we think, we did this in the past. I'm sure it's going to be true the same in the future. And so we go about it even though variables have changed. Or we have things like confirmation bias, where we have an outcome that we really, really want. And so then we just kind of handpick, almost subconsciously, the information that supports that, and we ignore warning signs. So these frameworks and these questions will help you get out of your head, help you identify some of those biases, and help you make better decisions moving forward.
Yeah, and that every person on the team probably has their own biases they're bringing to the table. So what is the conversation like if you're in the meeting with the team and you're working on a project? How do you kind of circumvent that? How do you ask those good questions to weed all of that out?
Yeah, some of it is just continuing to ask questions. I think a lot of people share opinions as facts, right? And so if you take everything that everybody says as a fact, then what's going to happen is you're going to end up making poor decisions based on those biases. But asking questions of like, well, what data supports that? Where did that come from? What are the variables that are different? What could go wrong? Do we even want to do this? It's just slowing down enough and asking the questions that is going to help set things up to be better in the long run.
So the theme I'm hearing is add less, say less, and ask more.
Exactly.
That's the key here. Okay, so this may sound overwhelming, a lot of frameworks, questions to ask. What is one small tweak that the leaders listening can start doing, can create that habit to form critical thinking amongst their team?
Yeah, I would say set aside time to think. Most people are just running and gunning. They don't have time, and they're just making decisions as they go. If you are setting aside specific time to think, you're going to actually do it. It's not something that we naturally do. We don't naturally sit down and say, hey, I want to ask questions that are going to get me out of my own headspace, right? But setting aside time and putting together a set of questions like the ones we talked about today to help you kind of get out of that space. The other thing is, before you make any decision, there's another framework out there called HALT. And it says, don't make any decision or do anything if you're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. Because those are emotions that will cause you to skew in a certain way. So if you have any of those, halt or stop and take a step back until that emotion has passed, and then you can lean in and start making better decisions.